Welcome to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where you can learn and be inspired by real-world examples of how technology is transforming businesses and reshaping industries in a language everyone can understand. Here is your host, Neil C. Hughes.
Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast. A quick question for you all. Do we have any legal eagles listening to this podcast? Because I'm conscious we did speak with Dentons last week, who are one of the biggest law firms in the world. It was a fantastic interview and so many big insights came from that episode. But I wanted to continue that conversation of how technology is transforming the legal world. And Clio is a leading cloud-based legal software used by 150,000 legal professionals spanning 100 countries. And they have partnerships, I believe, with 66 bar associations and law societies around the world. But Clio appeared on my radar when they recently launched their 5th annual Legal Trends report, which examines how COVID-19 has impacted the legal industry and facilitated cloud technology adoption, as well as how the pandemic has shifted consumer expectations around the legal services that they offer. And this year's Legal Trends report, if you're outside the community, is a standard benchmark for the legal community. It indicates that a transition to virtual services prompted by COVID-19 has set a new foundation for the future of the legal industry. So I invited George onto the podcast today, who is the Chief Operating Officer at Clio, to talk about the legal practice management software there at Clio and also share some insights from that report. So buckle up and hold on tight as I beam your ears all the way to Vancouver, where today's guest is waiting to speak with me. So a massive warm welcome to the show, George. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
Absolutely. So I'm the Chief Operating Officer at a company called Clio, which is the leading provider of web-based legal practice management software for law firms. We're based in Vancouver over in Canada. I've been with Clio for just over 10 years. And we are excited to pursue our mission of transforming the practice of law for good, in particular by providing technology that helps law firms serve the many people out there who need access to legal advice.
And before you came on the podcast, I did a quick little research. I quickly learned that your cloud-based legal software is used by 150,000 legal professionals across 100 countries with its own conference, Clio Cloud Conference, and on-demand, of course, the on-demand centre, the Clio Academy. But there will be a lot of people listening that are hearing about you guys for the first time. So can you tell the listeners a little bit more about how you're helping legal teams with this technology?
Absolutely. So we describe our tools as being centered on the client experience and helping law firms deliver an online client experience. So this involves tools that support intake, so getting started when someone inquires with a law firm. These include tools that do things all the way through invoicing. So as the law firm serves the client and of course runs their own, what's often called practice management or time tracking and billing, and runs their own revenue and receivables or turnover. We provide a suite of technology solutions, all cloud-based and also available through mobile that we consider to be leading and, of course, best in class. And often for many law firms, the first time that they've used a technology solution of this type to both run their own practices, but also collaborate with their clients on every step of the client journey.
And the legal industry used to be accused of being slow to adapt to technological change. And I get the impression that that is really changing now, especially with more and more legal companies wanting to lead the way there. And LegalTech seems to be thriving. But I'm curious, how much have you seen things change over the years?
Yeah, well, having been with Clio and working in the industry for over a decade here, it's been very interesting seeing the transition and the change that's taken place. I think lawyers and law firms don't often deserve to be painted with a broad brush as they are, as there are lots of different folks, and some are early adopters, others are lagging. But there's a reason they earn the reputation that they do. And I think versus other professional services disciplines, even like accounting or financial professionals, they have been slow to adapt. They've been slower to move into new technologies, and there are a variety of reasons for that. There are their own preferences and the nature of the industry itself and what they're trained to do in the background that they come from. Of course, there are also ethics obligations that law firms have to their clients. And so it's been very important to see a technology ecosystem including Clio, that's developed around them and made it more possible than ever for them to embrace this change. And as such, we've seen a really exciting technology space erupt around law firms. Now, with that said, the technology transition has been a gradual one. There's been progress and increased momentum every year. And it was one of the most eye-opening things about 2020, as it was, of course, in many professions. But I think what we saw a bit in 2020 was the demands of remote work and also a pretty steep decline in demand that has led to a lot of rapid transformation and change amongst law firms as they look to serve their clients in new ways.
And one of the reasons that I was excited to invite you on the podcast today was after recently seeing that you'd launched your 5th annual Legal Trends report, which examines how COVID-19 has impacted the entire legal industry and facilitated cloud technology adoption. And we have seen it at the impacts of a global pandemic and how it's almost acted as a digital accelerant. So I'm particularly interested in how it's affected the legal industry, as well as how the pandemic has shifted the consumer expectations around legal service offerings too. So can you tell me a little bit more about this year's report and what it reveals, especially around virtual services prompted by COVID-19 and how that set a new foundation for the legal industry's future?
Absolutely, Neil. It's a 5th year that we're doing the study and a very, very interesting time, to say the least. So we have the opportunity to review aggregated and anonymized data from tens of thousands of legal professionals and reviewing the economic impacts of COVID-19 through 2020 and beyond. We also accompany this with 2 companion surveys where we poll over 2,000 practicing legal professionals and over 2,000 clients or consumers, so folks who either have or maybe just part of the general population could be using lawyer services. And we test for their attitudes and awareness and what they're expecting as they're going through this tumultuous time. And perhaps no surprise, but I think a first in the legal profession, we've seen some very dramatic shifts. So for example, in the digital transformation space, everything from adoption of remote courts, which have happened in most jurisdictions for the very first time, straight through to the way that clients are expecting to both find, but then also work with a law firm as they seek for legal advice. So for example, we see the majority, 56% of consumers say that they believe that most legal matters can be dealt with remotely. This is to say without ever meeting face-to-face or in person. The report also revealed that 67% of consumers said they prefer lawyers who can share documents electronically. This mapped to a whole series of other touch points where consumers clearly preferred and altogether began expecting that their law firms would be able to support them in digital information exchange and collaboration. And for most law firms, mapping out a client journey and then making sure that they have digital touch points that support it is a brand new first. And we saw law firms come to us in unprecedented numbers looking for ways to do this as driven by client expectations. And I think another thing we saw was an overall deferral of consumption in the legal market. And the way to think about that is most folks who have a legal problem and are thinking about maybe getting advice are choosing to defer that with the financial uncertainty that they're experiencing right now. We saw that impact very significant, or rather we saw a very significant impact to law firms right out of the gate in terms of their receivables, their turnover, and what economic factors they were observing in the market. And so what we're seeing is more competition and a switch to not doing business in the way that law firms prefer and having clients accord to that, but to building the entire way that the interaction is taking place to what the client's expectations are as the market is getting more and more competitive.
And obviously, I think we've all had to adjust to video conferencing and working from home, etc. And we've all probably seen that viral video. I think it was actually a court case, I believe, and the lawyer had a cat filter on during a live hearing. But I'm curious, how have you seen the pandemic affect the business of legal practice?
Well, it's been a transformational impact, to say the least. Obviously, there are plenty of anecdotes, and I think the one of the lawyer that's gone viral with the sad kitten filter is one great example. But I mean, we've seen everything from judges, getting online and using tools like Zoom or other video casting solutions for the first time, and we've seen a lot of creativity driven by necessity. At the outset of the pandemic, the most significant impact we saw, like we saw across the board in much of the economy, was a dramatic hit. Almost all law firms reported declines in revenues, first declines in new matter intake, so new cases that they were seeing, and the number of overall inquiries declining sharply, followed briefly afterward by a sharp decline in their billings. So law firms, like most businesses, took a very direct hit, especially in the opening months of the COVID-19 pandemic, and then had to, from there, plan on how and where to reopen, how and where to continue reserving their clients, and how to adapt. And so I think what we've seen this turn into in legal is a bit of an evolutionary moment where law firms that have been deferring change or that haven't been sure if the way forward is digital have embraced that in unprecedented numbers. And so some examples of what we see, 78% of consumers who are now impacted by the economic realities of the pandemic expect their law firm to offer them flexible payment options. So these would be things like payment plans or perhaps alternative fee arrangements versus just paying by the hour, where we typically see law firms bill clients at an hourly rate and with relatively no cap in terms of how long it'll take to conclude a matter. Another major shift we're seeing is unprecedented numbers of law firms actually operate without fixed commercial office space. So even in the very beginning of the pandemic, we saw over 7% of law firms let go of their office space altogether, with a further 12% saying they're unsure whether they will maintain space at all. And again, as you might imagine, without this circumstance that we've been through in 2020, it's highly unlikely that those firms would have felt that way. And we're seeing more than ever firms switch their models and support clients, but also double down or perhaps take a full bet on a digital client experience by releasing their physical office locations.
And one of the things that I've been a big fan of, I think it's since the 2012 Olympic Games, was the revelations around marginal gains. And I first saw it with, I think it was the Team GB cycling team, where they set out to improve 1% of absolutely everything, from the comfort on a team bus to the 1% of every single aspect of the bike. And they went on to win numerous gold medals. And I've also seen those marginal gains be used in IT as part of continual service improvement methodologies. But I've read recently that you've got a very similar theory around that and the benefits that it can bring to the legal practice. So can you tell me a little bit more about the aggregation of marginal gains in the legal industry too?
Absolutely. I think this is one our UK cycling fans would be very excited about. And the GB national team, as you mentioned, at the Olympic Games, huge inspiration for this line of thinking. And so what we were able to do was, while studying the overall impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on legal, which of course was predominantly negative, pretty much a bad news story. Demand went down, billings went down, law firms were severely impacted. But within that, we were able to see that there were some firms that significantly outperformed their peers. And by significant, I mean firms that were reporting 40% more collected revenue per lawyer than their peers, which at a time like that, that would be a huge difference in any time, but at a time where effectively demand in their market was tanking, this particularly stood out to us as a real eye-opener. So we decided to get curious about that and investigate more thoroughly and more closely what was going on in these firms that were significantly outperforming their peers at such a challenging time. And what we found was there wasn't really one smoking gun or overarching reason. There was this pattern very similar to the aggregation of marginal gains that was at play. So when we got more curious about this, what we found was that firms that were deploying 3 technology solutions to serve their clients were the ones that were outperforming their peers in a significant way. And those 3 areas were online payments, so supporting credit card payments or other electronic methods of allowing clients to pay, which I know in this day and age seems like something obvious, but is actually not typically what you'd find at most law firms. Client portals, so online tools that would allow collaboration and exchange of things like documents, and tasks, and deadlines, and even asynchronous information. So a place where a client can log in, or an app to check in on what the updates are in their case. And finally, automated client intake solutions. So this is where law firms were digitizing the intake process where someone would inquire and look to work with their firm. So online payments, online client portals, and online client intake. All 3 of those things were cloud-based areas of technology. And all 3 of them spoke to individual gains. So firms using one of these solutions were already outperforming their peers who were not using them. But when firms were using all 3, they aggregated into this disproportionate impact, hence this aggregation of marginal gains, where those were the ones that were significantly further ahead. And our finding there is that these firms were far more adaptable and prepared for this massive shift in client expectations and, of course, operating requirements that was was and is still currently presented by the pandemic.
And I also read that you conducted a method of study known as the max diff analysis that essentially enabled you to identify what priorities are most important for lawyers and their clients. Can I ask that you expand on that as well?
Absolutely. One of my favorite areas to spend some time. Analysis tools. So max diff analysis, or what folks might more commonly experience it as, is a best-worst scale. Is one of many tools we could choose to use, but the one that we thought was the best fit for what we were curious about. And so in doing that, we presented a series of factors as preferences and asked clients and lawyers both with the same list to rank their preferences from best to worst. And then, of course, model this over thousands of responses and look to see what patterns emerged. Now, very interestingly, this is our 5th year doing this analysis, and obviously I've been working in the legal and legal technology space for a while. The typical story we come back with here is clients off in one corner and lawyers off in another corner with completely unmatched expectations of how things should work, what's most important, or even lawyers trying to understand what's important to their clients. In previous years, we found these tremendous disconnects in this kind of experience or client journey that law firms need to support and provide. This year, for the very first time, we found that they were identical. So, for example, the single most important factor for both lawyers and clients was to ensure that there were quality online reviews and access to referrals for folks who were looking to find a law firm. Both recognize that in this time, this is one of the most important things. Finishing dead last, perhaps unsurprisingly, but again, more of a surprise that clients and lawyers' heads were in the same spaces in terms of preferences, were physical office spaces. So gone are the days where the way a law firm would show to its clients that it's successful and a great choice for them is with a beautiful foyer or lobby and a Class A real estate space with expensive artwork hanging off the walls. And in are the days where the law firm's primary concern is making sure their clients know through online reviews and other forms of feedback in the market that they provide a great experience and are a great firm to work with. And those I can confidently declare are absolute firsts in this particular space.
And looking at the report, it looks like businesses will need to design client experiences that are ultimately online first. So I'm curious, how are you helping businesses through a transition like this?
It's a great question and speaks directly to our mission as a company. And so both in terms of what we offer today, but of course as well in terms of what we expect to offer in the future and continue to innovate, our job is to be a technology solution and a platform that empowers law firms that are cloud-based and client-centered. So we need to create the cloud tools that make it possible for them to provide this sort of online-first experience. And then they need to make sure that they're being client-centered in the experiences that they create. Some example for those, we mentioned earlier that now the majority of clients expect and that most prefer to meet virtually with a lawyer for an initial consultation, with 52% believing that most legal matters, as we mentioned earlier, could be handled remotely without ever having to meet in person at all. Our job is to make that as seamless and easy as possible from the law firm's perspective if they decide to serve their clients in that way. Similarly, 69% of consumers say that they prefer to work with a lawyer who can share documents electronically, so through a web page, app, or online portal. And again, our job as a technology provider is to make these tools easy, robust, and accessible to everyone who'd like to use them, and to make sure that they're designed in an elegant and easy to use way from both the lawyer's perspective, but also now from the client's perspective, as they'll be engaging with these technology solutions as well. So that's obviously a very rich vein and many, many things for us to be doing in there for a long time, but that's the high level of how we expect to play our role in transforming access to legal services, and of course, helping steer the legal profession as a whole into a more client experience facing direction.
And for anyone listening that would like to dig a little bit deeper on the report that we've talked about today, or even find out a little bit more information on the Clio Cloud Conference and the On-Demand Training Center Clio Academy, or anything that we've talked about today, what's the best way of doing that?
It's a great question. So everyone can head to Clio.com, so CLIO.com. I'll mention for users in the UK, there is a redirect that will take you to our UK site and help you get access to UK specific resources. And from there, you can discover our legal trends report. You can learn about the product itself Of course, you can also get in touch with us via social media. So look up Clio, again, CLIO, on LinkedIn, or at GoClio, so GOCLIO on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Myself, George Psiharis, Psiharis, folks can find on LinkedIn.
Well, I've loved chatting with you today. And before you came on the podcast, I was excited to learn more about the legal trends and how technology is impacting the industry, etc. But in particular, it was really impressed me today is that talk of aggregation of marginal gains and that max diff analysis, along with everything that you're doing there. So more than anything, just a big thank you for sitting down with me today and talking through some of that. I'm sure it'll be invaluable to a lot of people in the legal industry. But I'd love to stay in touch with you, do it all again later in the year. But thanks for joining me today.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Neil. It's been a real pleasure. And likewise, we look forward to doing it again sometime.
What a great guide, and another great reason or excuse for me to visit Vancouver if I'm ever able to fly again. But I do live in hope. And although February is a notoriously short month, the shortest month of the year, we've somehow been able to have the biggest number of listeners ever on this podcast, and it's starting to feel like we've built something quite special here. And I just wanted to take a few moments to reiterate that wherever you listen to this podcast in the world, I want to help make your voice heard, put your city or country or startup on the map, and start getting more of these positive tech stories shared around the world. So please, I invite you all to email me, techblogwriter@outlook.com. Connect with me on social, but don't just hit follow. I want you to send me a quick message. Hey, Neil, I listened to the podcast, so I know who you all are. Not in a sinister way, of course. And you can find me nice and easily. I'm just at Neil C. Hughes on Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, and even Clubhouse, which I've not used yet. I need a bit of help trying to get to grips with that one. So any tips on that would be appreciated. And if you've got any comments about any of the topics we've talked about today, if you've got any questions you'd like to ask me, if you'd like to come on the podcast, whatever it is, please send me a quick message. But more than anything, just thank you for choosing to listen to this podcast. The first episode was actually published on Friday, July the 10th, 2015, and the show has come a long way since then, and we've found our way together. And when I first launched it, I just wanted to connect with the readers of my written work and prove that technology works best when it brings people together. And every one of you listening who sends me a message, shares your own insights, and joins me on the podcast here, you're all proof that it really does. But enough of me going all sentimental there. So what I'm trying to say is a big thank you for listening, and I hope you'll join me again tomorrow. And until next time, don't be a stranger.
Thank you for listening to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast with Neil C. Hughes. Remember, technology works best when it brings people together.